So, two of the more challenging films, I would say, about children in World War II would be Elon Klima's Come and See, made in the 80s. It's a Russian film. And Václav Marl's The Painted Bird, which was made, I think, in the late 2010s, just like 5 or 6 years ago. And um, I would say the main kind of commonalities between the two are that they both follow a child witnessing war, and specifically like the adult complications of war. They both are pretty much about the main character moving through different sections and different scenarios of moral ruin, and encountering um, various institutions and scenarios full of predatory or absent adults who really just want to cause pain for the most part. Um, both films are episodic. It's each film is kind of like, both films are kind of like a chain of encounters that pretty much become the narrative engine of the picture. And each episode is almost like a moral test, rather than an actual like plot point. Both films are very distinctly anti-war, but I would say neither of them sermonize. I think that the horrors of human behavior are shown more as kind of an ordinary thing, rather than a pathological sort of response to circumstance. And then I would say the key difference, or I'd say the key commonality between the two pictures is that they both have a bit of a spiritual undertow. Both carry images that almost sort of have like a biblical or folklorish type of um, sort of presence to them. And both of them invite plenty of readings beyond what they specifically or explicitly, I guess, depict. Both tend to have a little bit more of a ritualistic approach when it comes to depicting animals and burials and food and fire and torment. Um, and I would say that both films are about the complications at the end of the day of humanity, and specifically being human. I'd say they both diverge when it comes to their aims. I think that Come and See kind of feels a little bit like a howl regarding the Belarus uh, historical event, and both are sort of about. Uh, I mean, I would say that Come and See specifically is about what it means to be a witness to history, and how uh, and I think that the film itself is about how one would maybe exercise that, holding on to that history. I also kind of feel like Come and See sort of funnels a little bit more of a cathartic. uh, he funnels towards a little bit more of like a cathartic frame, and I would also say that there's a little bit more of a stylistic verb with Come and See, in the sense that it makes pretty effective use of like reverse montage. And I also feel that the ending almost argues a little bit with who specifically writes history, But then you look at The Painted Bird, and removing the whole Kaczynski element, because that I feel like complicates the story. I think The Painted Bird works better if you look at it on its own terms and look at it separately from the book. Not that the book isn't fascinating; it definitely is. I read it when I was in high school, and it was a pretty mesmerizing story. But I would say that The Painted Bird is kind of about the movie is kind of keeping a little bit more of a radical distance, with the intention of allowing the viewer to focus more on who the main character is, and what their core elements are. And so I think that the camera often tends to take a little bit more of an observant type of approach, rather than identify the main character as having this desire or this interest. I think that the film actually intentionally sort of removes those elements because they want to kind of uh, break it down to the bare basics of the child experience. But this child ends up being a little bit more of, like, I guess you could call him like something of a receptacle for deranged adult human impulses. Um, and so I guess The Painted Bird is sort of like a pilgrimage, but with no real revelation, no promised revelation. It's like an ethical stress test of the viewer's need to have things explained to them. I think that both films are they also differ on what the ethics of witnessing and looking are. Come and See is kind of about trying to Come and See is trying to immerse the viewer, and it's trying to make something of an indictment on violence. It's like it's trying to make a little bit more of a specific statement, and it actually uses its camera techniques and its filmmaking techniques as a way of weaponizing the proximity that we have towards the subject matter. So it makes use of things like shaky cam and intense audio bleed, all intentionally done. And I think the goal of Come and See is to force us to feel these things and then encourage us to reject these things. That's the sense that I get. It also tends to risk making things into a spectacle, often by sort of creating these really ambitious scene setups, but then it ends up kind of anchoring everything with very specific types of atrocities and villains that are targetable. But then as it goes along, it starts to kind of dilute all those things and blur the lines between morality and survival. The Painted Bird, on the other hand, is much more ambiguous with the way it makes its indictments, because it's so sharp. It's so sharply from the point of view of a child. And so, like, I kind of got the sense that, when I watched The Painted Bird, that it's asking about it's a film that's asking about what it means to look at these things, and it's challenging the viewer to actually um find an answer. It's not a cynical movie exactly, but it does risk being labeled as nihilistic and aesthetically cruel. And I think that because of that, it it makes it hard to find like a stable moral ground with The Painted Bird. I think that the scale of both films are incredible, but I would say that Come and See is much more grounded in Soviet history and mythos and factuality. Like, I think that the Come and See is very, very explicitly political. Um, and it's also explicitly personal. The Painted Bird is completely denationalized. It's multilingual. They use a little bit more of a they they uh, they decide to shift the language to one of interslavic. It's like an interslavic language, as a way of kind of blurring any sort of specificity as to who this film is trying to critique. I think that the lack of a specific answer as far as who the true villain is, the true source of darkness is partially it's a big part of what makes The Painted Bird such a challenge, such a political challenge to watch. Because so much about it is implicated, and like, it's implicated instead of stated, and so there's so much cruelty that emerges from just basic economics, sex, religion, and all of that. It gets amplified by by the the historical setting. And then I would say the way the films are just overall crafted together is very different from each other. There's a bit of a muddiness that it is inescapable when it comes to Come and See, and he makes pretty effective use of like the wide angle lens, um, as sort of a way of creating a little bit more of a kaleidoscope of violence and conflict. Whereas The Painted Bird is completely monochrome and tends to take each vignette on its own terms, despite okay, the whole thing is in black and white, and yet each part feels very separate from each other, I would say, despite the repetitive, redundant tone of the film and structure of the film. The Painted Bird isn't really so much about vignettes as much as it is about kind of a crafting of dynamic senses. It's a much more kind of sensory oriented type of movie, I would say. And I think because it's in monochrome, you kind of feel those senses more. Whereas Come and See puts those senses front and center, and kind of pushes us to look outside of those things. So it's in a way, both films are sort of doing the opposite, but taking sort of a similar stance. I would say that Come and See, audio wise, is the more unpleasant of the two, even though The Painted Bird is full of screaming and full of sequences of torment and intense emotion. Come and See is more about like the three-dimensional experience of war. And while there are dimensions to The Painted Bird, all those dimensions are muted by the fact that it's a story of an individual trying to survive. There's a lot more of a psychic collapse in Come and See. The Alexei Kravchenko character, the main character in it, Flora, you see his disenchantment throughout the course of the film. You see his the way he becomes completely run ragged by his experiences, and you see it constantly, like in almost every shot. Many sequences in the film feel like POV shots. The whole film almost feels like a POV shot, like an IMAX experience, except it's like an anti-IMAX experience, because instead of inviting the viewer to ooh and ah at what they're seeing, they're kind of forcing the viewer into a place where they can't hide from the claustrophobia of the violence. And then you look at The Painted Bird and the Peter Cutler character, and I actually feel like The Painted Bird actually is less about the psychic collapse of him, and more trying to create a somewhat of a reserved statement on how he becomes gradually disenchanted. But what's interesting about the Painted Bird is how it doesn't really frame that disenchantment as either a good or a bad thing. It definitely shows that the things that are happening to him are bad, but it doesn't exactly. It doesn't say that this is the be all end all. In the end, after he endures all of these atrocities, time and time again, he is still shown to be alive and breathing and affected, for sure, but with an intense willingness from beginning to end to survive. I would say Come and See achieves a lot in the sense that it makes atrocities less abstract, and it actually gives the anti-war genre something of a more definitive first-person testament. And so I would say that Come and See, as a historical picture about the horrors of war, is a valuable film. And very much worth exploring and delving into. As painful as it is to watch, it's it's there's a constant intention to it, and the intentions are always pretty clear and obvious. And even though I don't know that I can fully appreciate everything that the film does, like I've never really been too keen on killing real animals in movies. I know that my favorite filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky did it with Andrei Rublev, and it's not like I was happy to see that scene in that movie. I certainly didn't appreciate that, but I certainly also understood the meaning to it and the meaning behind it, and I understand the meaning of the killing of the animals in Come and See, or well, specifically the cow. The Painted Bird, there is a lot of animal death and torture, but you don't. But I don't think any of it's real. A lot of it seems um, kind of more smoke and mirrors and kind of more uh, utilized with clever camera techniques and visual effects and sound design to create the illusion. And so, to me, I'd say The Painted Bird in many ways is kind of the more cinematic film, because I tend to think of cinema as being a little bit more of a magic trick in the sense that you're making the viewer experience something and see something that they think that they're seeing and feeling but aren't really. I think The Painted Bird is much more effective at kind of achieving that. Um, and I would say that all the lessons of The Painted Bird tend to be there tends to be a little bit more of a suspect quality to them. Like you're not quite sure if the lesson that you are feeling the film is trying to provide you is truly the one that's meant to be taken away. And that's kind of how the main character in the film feels a lot of the time, you know? So I feel like in that sense, the Painted Bird is kind of making you feel more like the main character, you know? Um, and also I would say the Painted Bird does tend to pry more at religion, like ideas of religion and desire and punishment and pity. And it's also kind of about how history, at a certain point when you're experiencing it, it doesn't explain itself. You know, it's almost more up to the survivors to be able to articulate what all these things meant. Um, I'd say at the end of the day, as much of a masterpiece as I consider Come and See to be, I do think that The Painted Bird is the better, more effective film for a lot of reasons, actually. I think it takes much bigger aesthetic risks. I think the fact that it refuses color and conventional coverage and emotive music, even while staging all these extreme actions, I think that that actually provides a lot more a lot more cues for empathy and moral friction. I think that tying the complicated morality of the movie into one sense of empathy, I think is something that I would say is much braver for it's much more brave for a film to do. You know, rather than the Come and See approach, which is to make the message clear and concise and unambiguous so that the viewer can walk away knowing that they understand something more about what it was like to experience the violence of Belarus in World War II. I think that The Painted Bird asks a lot of questions, a lot more questions than Come and See asks. But I would also have to say that the questions that The Painted Bird asks, a lot of them are not as easily answerable. And in fact, I would actually say a lot of the questions it's asking they might not even have answers really. Um, it's not because it's not really a film that's asking about what happened during this time period. It's more a film that's asking it's trying to get the audience and the viewer to kind of think a little bit more about what is community when there's like a curdling of belief, and um why is it that pity can be a humiliating thing? Why is caring about somebody uh associated with pity, and also to what extent does witnessing atrocity become a participation in that atrocity? I work in a school, in an educational environment, and these are questions that I often sort of wonder about myself, as far as like when I understand that a kid like witnesses violence in their home, or violence in their environment, or violence amongst their peers, and doesn't act on it. I know that it's easy to assume that the bystander is the one who holds the most responsibility, but it also is never that simple, because the kid who is the witness may have their own baggage and may have their own reasons for not being involved. I love the fact that The Painted Bird kind of goes really far out of its way to withhold any kind of catharsis. There's not really any sort of like absolution. There's no montages even. It's just really about a boy whose gestures are pretty much based completely within survival. And then I also feel like The Painted Bird complicates the idea of guilt a lot, because a lot of the violence arises from neighbors, priests, surrogate parents, passerbys, widows, people that you don't always expect violence to come from. I mean, I would say that the specific priest character in this movie isn't really a violent person, but he does end up enabling violence to happen, even if he doesn't mean to. And so, in a sense, he does have a responsibility, but it's not a responsibility that he's ever going to be able to face because of the circumstances in which those sort of actions unfolded in. And then also, the child himself, in a sense, becomes a villain as well, because eventually he ends up having to become a monster in his own right, and he ends up having to become a killer. And so because of all these things, the black and white photography actually starts feeling really severe. The way the film is framed, and the duration, and how each choice the film kind of goes out of its way to be as ungratuitous as possible by stripping away any kind of sensational flourish that could exist. But then because of that, the film actually feels a lot more philosophical and almost pliable to the way we often apply mythology to our own lives. And so, one could make the case that the film is almost like a study of like erotic economies, or almost like it's trying to kind of dissolve the whole idea of language and meaning, but it's not doing it through demonization. It's kind of doing it more through just the act of natural human actions and behaviors. I think The Painted Bird is more trusting of the audience. The fact that there's almost no dialogue in it, and the fact that it withholds so much exposition, and how there's no specific kind of real language that the film is trying to center itself around. It is kind of forcing the viewer to work a lot harder. And then I would also say that the film kind of reframes the performance of the child as well, like the way a child performs on screen. This is a film about a kid living through various aftermaths. Everything that he experiences tends to be very fast and brief, but hideous. So much of the film is kind of more about the hindsight experience. And then I guess also I feel like The Painted Bird kind of enlarges the genre of what a war film can really express. And I think it does that by kind of making its atrocities legible and tolerable and repeatable. And so it doesn't really. So what I love about The Painted Bird is that it doesn't take like the Tarantino approach, which is very cynical to me. It's very not. It's very like it's very sarcastic. The Tarantino approach. This film is very removed from the idea of sarcasm, and that's not to say that there aren't moments that are kind of darkly humorous. I will admit the scene with the crows attacking the kid's head. It's a horrible scene, but I did feel also that there was a little bit of a sense of wit to it that did actually make the experience more a little bit feel a little bit more human, you know. And maybe that's why the black and white photography works so well. You know, the film uses such intense use of silence. Um, but I guess what I really love about The Painted Bird is how it's a movie about the reclaiming of identity. It's a film about how the the perspective is very much focused on the main kid and his attempts at um, getting at being stable, at reclaiming some sense of stability. You know, at first it's about him wanting to go home, and then as it goes on, it becomes less about that and more um, about how he's gonna survive this day, or how he's gonna survive this situation, or how he's gonna survive what's happening now. And that's kind of how the film sort of begins to manifest into a portrait of a monster. Um, but then, because of that, and because of how the film is sort of making it feel like there's some sort of psychological or moral erasure going on, we actually get to sort of come to terms with the fact that we all kind of have had these moments of survival instincts and fight or flight situations, you know. And so it's kind of through the utilizing of the name, and through the facial expressions and all that stuff, that we actually do sort of gain a little bit more of like a bridge, like an emotional bridge between the main protagonist and ourselves. We actually we recognize that these institutions that he's getting involved in and getting experiencing so much torment from, have less to do with anything that's his fault and more to do with the fact that everybody around him is in a state of desperation, and he's just unlucky enough to be picked out of the flock, either because he's Jewish, or because he's a gypsy, or because of, you know, something. I mean, his race is completely ambiguous. His identity is completely ambiguous. But and you know, even though he does end up doing some pretty monstrous things eventually, it's not like we feel opposed to him. It's not like we feel as though the film is trying to turn us against him. And so I think that at the end, when the Peter Kotlar character, when it becomes indicated that he still knows his name, and he still has managed to clasp his identity, that's a lot more moving. And I guess that's kind of, I think that The Painted Bird, despite it being such a difficult movie to watch at many times, often to the point where it's like almost unbearable, I do really feel like there is something much more inherently life-affirming about it. And I would actually argue that it's more life-affirming than most movies, in fact. The Alexei Kochenko character in Come and See is definitely a vessel in certain ways for our own humanity, because the way he expresses his emotions, and the emotions that we see him experience, and the things that we see him endure, they do gain their own meaning as we continue to watch. And then that meaning ends up sort of feeling a lot more complicated at the end, with the whole the montage involving him refusing to shoot the portrait of baby Hitler on his mother's lap. You know, as soon as he sees that, he begins to weep, and it's because he does have an emotional bridge to his own childhood. And at the start of Come and See, this is a kid who actually wants to be involved in this conflict. This is a kid who wants to be a symbol of his his home and his world and his community. He does want to be a hero. But at the end, when he realizes what he's lost, and he ends up kind of melding into the Russian army, we aren't really sure what's left of his identity at the end. And so that's really sad, and that's pretty painful, but that's also a pretty inescapable reality of war and conflict. And I think Elam Klimov does a pretty tremendous job of emphasizing that and exploring the aftermath of those kinds of things, as well as sort of breaking down just the complete illogical reality of war. Now, personally, I think Elam Klimov's masterpiece isn't Come and See. I think it's Welcome or No Trespassing, which is a film that is ahead of its time, or was ahead of its time in a number of different ways. And even watching it now, there are certain elements to it that feel unmistakably modern. And I also find that movies about childhood tend to be a better encapsulation of the overall human experience. But having said that, I do think Come and See is a masterpiece. And even though I think that The Painted Bird is a much more groundbreaking film in many, many ways regarding these elements and themes, I would say that both movies are absolutely worth watching. I don't know that I would recommend The Painted Bird as easily to most people, because so many aspects of the film are so dizzying and bizarre and almost otherworldly in their revolting visuals. I think that there are also just many more aspects of The Painted Bird that more people can relate to. I mean, I think we've all known people in our own lives that are in and of themselves painted birds, who just can't seem to catch a break, who can't seem to really escape these pits of darkness that they're constantly being forced into, despite often putting in their own efforts. I mean, I've definitely known a lot of kids in my life that are like that have experienced those kinds of things. I've definitely known a lot of adults in my life who just for whatever reason are just dealt a poor deck from day one.